Hello all, we will begin the webinar in just a couple minutes. Please stand by. All right, so we're going to get started. I want to welcome you all today. Thank you for attending. Today we're going to be covering why SMBs should prepare for GDPR and what our multi-phase methodology is for getting you compliant. Before we start, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping items. The webinar is going to be about 30 minutes, and we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for your questions. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to utilize that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Or if you have any comments, or if you want to open up any other discussions to the whole attendees itself, you can utilize the chat functionality as well. We are also recording this webinar, so if you have to step out midway, or if you were not able to attend today, we will have that recording for you. Now I'm going to be turning it over to Bob Thomas, who is our VCIO and our VCISO. A lot of acronyms here. Go ahead, Bob.
Thanks very much, Amber. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Just to get the rest of the housekeeping out of the way, VCIO is Chief Information Officer, and the VCISO is Virtual Chief Information Security Officer, just so you know what I do and what those title and acronyms mean. What we want to cover today is not just what GDPR is, but why we believe that it's going to be important looking forward for not just all businesses in the U.S., but particularly small to mid-sized businesses that are really feeling the pressure of trying to do the best job at securing the information that they hold. I just want to go over a little bit of background on GDPR. It was originally worked on as far back as 2015. The EU came up with a plan to try to create a standard across all of the countries under that umbrella so that they could, between countries when they're interchanging data, be able to work within the same rules and the same framework. The legislation was actually put into place and ratified in 2016, pretty early on in that year. But it's taken 2 years for it to really become effective, and really the switch has been turned on as of May 25th of this year, 2018. So it's been 6 months at this point that it's been in effect. There have been notices, companies have been put on notice to improve their security. And there have been, I believe it's now up to 97 different companies that have been fined by the organization that is overseeing the GDPR regulations. There are, what you probably should know, many different components to this. It's not just a technology thing. Technology does play a significant part in it, but it's all about people and the process that you guys use in order to interact with information on a daily basis. And the technology, of course, can assist and make that process better and make it easier to stay within the guidelines and be compliant. But at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with documentation and process and exactly what you ask of your staff and how they interact on a daily basis. The goal at the end of the day is really to protect the customer's data. And a lot of people think first that it's always customer data. It's not just customer data. It is vendor data as well. If those folks that you are storing their information for exist inside the EU community, as the slides progress, we're going to go over which countries are covered under the EU umbrella. But we want to be able to make sure that the data is protected in the best possible way to avoid notice and fines at that point. The format for protecting the data is broken really down into 3 pieces that we think ought to be discussed here and ought to be important for everyone. The first one, we thought about this when we get questionnaires from clients and they ask us to help us out. When they get questionnaires from the customers and vendors that they deal with, you may not even realize at this point that you're already subject to GDPR. You may not be. If there's no interaction whatsoever with anybody in the EU community, that's fine. But I'm going to show you in the upcoming slides ways that you may be collecting data that you're not aware that are part of the GDPR regulations. So that's where we're trying to get out in front of this. The second item, it's not just GDPR. There is probably going to be similar law that's going to cover the U.S. And the reason I think that way, it's not just me theorizing or people, talking about it on a daily or weekly basis. The state of California has actually already come up with their own law that is going into effect at the beginning of 2020. It's already being used today, and it's being, I'll call it beta tested. When we buy product as a company from one of our distribution centers, and that distribution location is inside California, they're already asking us to confirm that we're keeping the information that relates to that product and anyone that is using that product. So maybe it's being assigned to one of our customers and we have to insert the customer and user's information into the distribution center computer system. They're asking us to make sure that we are holding that information sacred and we're protecting that data, and we're certifying to that every single time we buy a product. And those are the types of things that are going into full effect roughly a year from now. And going forward, I think we could bet that there's going to be something that's more far-reaching, that's going to cover all of the U.S. and all of the data that's housed on people's systems. This is not going to be a subset where it's only going to be like today with the Department of Defense and the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards for Technology, where it only governs Department of Defense or government data. or ISO, where that's targeted or has been targeted at manufacturers and how they build process around creating information and storing information. This is going to be all business, not Fortune 500 and higher. This will be all businesses inside the United States and how the data that they're storing is protected. And the third thing, I've kind of already spoke to this, but we believe that it's just good business and it makes sense to get out in front and protect the data that you're already housing, whether it be EU data or it's, in some instances, if it's a medical practice, you've got patient information that's been covered under the HIPAA guidelines for many, many years, over a decade already. We think it makes sense to protect the data, but at the same time, small to mid-sized businesses are being breached at a tremendous rate, and they're targeted more so now than large corporations are. 58% of the time, small to mid-sized businesses are being targeted by a breach. Because of that, we think you ought to have the best protection for your data that makes sense already in place. You need to recover from a disaster. Those are things that really force the situation, and you better have a good plan in place and good protection for that data. We put up a slide here that why does it matter to small to mid-sized businesses? You think about storing data for somebody that's located in the EU. They don't actually, this is part of the law as well, they don't actually have to be a citizen there. They just have to be located in one of the EU countries. And if you have data on them and they're located there, or the second item is probably the most prominent here, utilizing a data download form. Almost everybody has a form on their website where they're collecting information, some username, first name, last name, maybe a phone number, maybe a street address, but almost every instance you've got an email address for someone. If you store that information and you are using that information, whether it be for marketing purposes or you're just building a database for future use, that is now protected, and most importantly, it's identifiable information. You need to be able to protect that data to the length that GDPR regulations dictate. If you're only collecting email addresses and not using them, okay, there might be a loophole where you might not have to comply, but it's hard to believe that you would be collecting information and not using it for some purpose. Very simple, working with customers, vendors. Those are obvious scenarios. If you've got somebody that's, I'll give you a perfect example. We deal with a vendor over in London. We need to interact with them on a, if not daily, weekly basis. And we have to have information on who they are, how to interact with them, phone, email, banking information. All of those pieces make it a covered situation for those folks. I want to just so everybody knows who's covered under this, we have put a list together of all of the countries in the EU, and there's a snapshot of them. It's a lot broader, and there's a lot more entities there than I had originally expected. But all of those have combined together. I think it's 26 of them or so that make up the EU umbrella. They've all agreed to enforce this regulation and legislation, and I would expect over time, yes, okay, the EU is a known entity. There will be the same type of thing in APAC. There will be something, whether it's US only or if it's all of North America or the Americas. There's going to be legislation to protect data because this is going to become a standard regardless of where you are in the country. I wanted to go over one item with respect to identifiable data, speaking specifically around what data you should consider collecting, and if you already do collect this should fall under the umbrella of what needs to be protected. I probably don't even have to go to the right-hand side of sensitive data, but the personal data side, just as I was talking about with these fill-in or downloadable forms, name, address, phone, I'll skip over bank for a minute, IP address, those pieces together, because you've got IP address of where they're coming from, that immediately can tie together with their name and address. You've now got all the information to be able to identify an individual or a company or both. If you place a cookie on somebody's computer, there are now very large, not disclaimers, but they are rules and terms and conditions around setting cookies on people's machines because they consider that a piece of identifiable information. You're tracking that computer or that user via your website. That's another piece of information that needs to be protected if you are collecting it. I'll go back to the bank and credit thing. Whenever we pay the folks over in London for the service that they provide to us, we've got to pay them via ACH or wire transfer. They don't do any sort of payment options. They don't use credit cards. Their method of payment is you're either wiring their money or you're transferring via ACH. If you've got that type of information stored in your system on that vendor or customer, that's another reason that you've got to protect that data under the GDPR regulations. This is, it seems a little all-encompassing, but they are trying their best to build a standard around what data is being collected on an everyday basis and how is it going to be protected by individuals and by firms moving forward. We want to take a few minutes and we want to go over our three-pronged approach as to how we go about getting to compliance. It includes gathering background information, and that's really the starting point. You need to get a baseline. So the gathering phase, it's not just what some folks would think are, oh, you get a checklist and you say, yes, 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 and I've got all these things in place, and maybe you do and maybe you don't. This is really looking at every system inside your organization. We're talking about getting a baseline for what your systems entail. And most importantly, this is not the stage where you say, oh, well, you pass or you fail based on what your systems are capable of. This is really, how do you store the data? What do your systems consist of? Do you have a firewall in place? How do you separate your data? All of the important things that make for a good system. We try to understand this in the gathering phase to try to determine what your systems look like and what your data protection is made up of at a moment in time. And then we can go on to the second phase, which is the assessment phase. We want to be able to not only gather the data, but we need to be able to see exactly what's going on with the systems and how they're operating. So we have to assess the information, and once we go through the assessment phase, which will give us an idea of exactly how your system is working, how's it functioning, if we need to test a backup system, how does that backup work, how much data would be lost in the event of an issue, what was the cause of the loss, how long can you be without it? That's all part of an assessment phase. And then the third part of our method to be able to deliver a product to get you to compliance is remediation. And we take all of the information that was done in the gathering phase and the assessment phase, and it generates a report, and that report will give us an idea of if you have any gaps, if there are issues that need to be addressed. We put together a plan that will remediate and put you and your firm in a better place. And our services to be able to deliver that, whether you need assistance, that's what we're here for. We can deliver those services that are wrapped around this whole three-part methodology and be able to deliver a compliance solution at the end of the day, bring you to compliance, and probably everybody should be aware that compliancy is not just the end goal. We want to be able to keep moving the security of your systems forward as time goes on, as regulations change, as new ones come on board. We want to be able to make sure you've got the best possible protection and security in place in your organization. And we talk about security. One of the things that we're going to come up against in one of the slides that's coming up, this is not just about data, it's access to information. And I think we're going to cover that in one of the next few slides as well. So we want to talk a little bit about the process here and exactly how we do this three-part method of getting to the end goal, which one of those things is getting a report that will help us all understand where you are. So the gathering information phase, we've got some questionnaires that are built. We do have some checklists, and we've got an example of some of that coming up. But I think most importantly, it is not just handing out paper and checking off a yes or no. We're interacting with people that know the information and the process and the technology at your firm. And as part of that, we want to be able to be on site. Part of this is a site survey to understand your environment. We do network scans. Those network scans are both internal and external. So we're trying to penetrate your network from the outside and make sure that it's secure and hardened as much as possible. And we're also trying to see where the traffic is going on the inside of your network. Is there any information that is potentially leaking out of your organization that you're not aware of? And some of the worksheets which speak to who on your staff might have access to information, maybe more access than they need. And we're gonna go over that, because that is really one of the important pieces of digging into the network and gathering information. We want to look in depth at how your network is operating and understand what your users have access to and how they're manipulating data on that network. On the next slide, we're going to show you, these are part of the to-do list. There is a site walkthrough where we need to assess the environment. We need to understand, is the information secure, and part of that is the equipment secure. That's a typical piece of this. We've got a specific compliancy questionnaire that's revolving around GDPR and the requirements of that. This may sound strange, but we also have an ISO 27001 questionnaire, which is all about cybersecurity and data security. So that is one of the items that is put into place and that we're going through as part of our gathering phase. We call it a to-do list, I suppose. And once these items are done, and there's we've checked them off our list, we go to the next phase, and we've got what I think is important is this site assessment, the walkthrough. I said earlier that this is not just about data and computers and servers and backup, but if you look at some of these, about, a third of the way down, lack of physical intrusion detection system. Well, that, people think about intrusion detection. A lot of them think about data and somebody trying to crack into your network. Well, this isn't that. This is, do you have an alarm system? Do you have an access control system? You have fire doors on the security perimeter. Do you have a way to not just control access to the building, but do you have a way to log it? Are there cameras? Do you have a visitor log? These are all pieces that should be part of any secure data system and physical office location. A lot of times we will see, and this, I talk to people about this almost every week, we walk into their facility, we have a business review meeting with them, and we see the server room door wide open. Of course, we ask, what are you doing with the door open? There's, sometimes there's no lock on it. Sometimes there is a lock on it, but they also use it to store their supplies. We saw this last week. It's too hot in there, so we leave the door open instead of having it properly ventilated or having a portable air conditioning unit. It ends up that it's crazy. They leave the door open 24/7. So why would there even be a door there? Why would there be a lock? Those are things that have to be addressed and have to be put in place. We've got people, we're actually addressing this with one of our clients. They have their server out in the middle of a records room where we've been told that people will walk up to the server and they'll put their coffee on it while they're doing something else. They're talking to somebody else, they'll just set it down. Well, that's a hazard. We don't want to see things like that. Next week, we're tearing that whole system down. We're putting it in a secure cabinet, and the administrator will have access to the cabinet. One of the partners will have access to the cabinet with the key. When we're there, we will meet with one of those folks, and that's how we'll gain access. But no one else will be able to access any of the equipment. They won't be able to unplug it. It will be completely self-contained. Those are the types of things that we want to try to understand during the site walkthrough. It's an assessment. And I think, before we go on to the next slide, one of the things that's really important, look at the first item, removable media not secure, left on desks. We walk up, as we're doing that survey, we're looking at every single item on people's desks. Do they have little USB drives and they're storing information on those and they just happen to leave it and walk away? This goes back to the whole Post-it note idea where people have passwords, and instead of remembering them, they have them posted on the underside of their keyboard. Those are the types of things that we look for. As part of the next phase of, once we get past the walkthrough assessment, there are questionnaires. And those questionnaires, one of them at the top of the list is, do you have a DPO, a data protection officer? And who is that individual? And it's great to know who they are, what their contact information is, but at the end of the day, why is that person assigned to that job? Do they have the qualifications to be a DPO? Do they know everything about your systems? Do they know how the data is being stored, where it's being stored? All of the idiosyncrasies of who on the network needs access and has just the access they need and nothing more. Who is in who's in the Active Directory list, if you're talking about on a Windows system, so that they can log in. Those are all important pieces of the compliancy questionnaire. And if that data protection officer happens to be, just I hate to say just the secretary, but if she doesn't have a technical background, that title is misassigned, and that is a problem. That does not meet the legislation and the regulation requirement for a real data protection officer that has the best interest of the firm in mind. After the compliancy questionnaire, we've got to perform some scans to the network. That scanning piece is done with some tools that we own or that we rent from someone. It will automatically be able to collect data on whether we've got the correct environment in place, we've got the correct security in place. It will scan from the outside in. It will also scan internally to look at exactly what's going on across the network. Do you have a firewall that's being able to block any of the traffic coming in from the outside and will not allow simple access into the system? Will it do, if we've got somebody that has too much access, it will log what folders they have access to and give us an idea of if they're in a typical quote-unquote everyone group, but they have access to the HR folder. They will tell us that. It will tell us if there's spyware on those computers and if there's anybody logging the information that they're keying in every single day. All of these pieces are part of the environmental scan that's done to determine exactly how hardened the system is and have we covered all our bases. And one of the items on there is run local scan of remote computers. This is not like the old days where we can just use traditional antivirus. Yeah, it's good to have antivirus, but there's machine learning, there's artificial intelligence to try to understand how people use computers each day. And if they're using them or seemingly using them in an abnormal fashion, we've got tools that will be able to capture that and log it and be able to notify us immediately that that's happened. That's what the new style of antivirus and anti-spyware will do. So we run each one of these scans against the environment so that we can report on do we have any gaps? Are we missing anything? And all of this information that we collect gets into a documentation application, and it gets in at the end of the day into a report. So we go through, we finish all these pieces, and then we've got all of the information that gets dumped into the reporting system. And we go over and we're looking at specific items. We're looking at any ports that might be open on the firewall, external port use. And why are they open? That's the real key to this. We need to understand if there's a port open, is there a valid reason for it to be open? There could very well be, but our mission in securing our clients' environments is really to make sure as little access exists as possible. We don't want to have, I hate to say willy-nilly, but open, easy access into people's computers for remote access or remote control, into servers without some sort of protection in place, VPN, virtual private network, to secure those connections. Another piece is, asset inventory review. For folks that are already clients of ours, we have a complete asset inventory. We've got an asset management system and an agent-based tool that we put on every piece of equipment at a client's location. But if we're visiting with somebody that's not one of our clients, we need to collect that information. So we need asset lists, we need user lists, we need to understand those users. What do they really need access to? I keep going back to that, but we need to understand, are they separated into groups? Are some of those people developers and don't need access to the production system, that they're in a test environment and that test environment is separated? We're looking at personal data. What do they have access to and what data are they creating? And where are they storing that data and how is it being secured? How is it being protected, backed up, replicated offsite? All the things that make for a good, secure, and good planned system. And as part of that personal data scan, we're also validating exactly where the data is being stored and what makes up that data. Is that data one of the types that we went through before? Is it names? Is it email addresses? Is it banking information? How is that being secured? This kind of goes to the credit card processing guidelines. A lot of people that take credit cards and process them, they have to validate via PCI compliance whether if they're storing those credit cards, are they storing them in a secure, encrypted manner? How can people get access to those cards? Are they being stored in an off-site system as opposed to on-site? How is access restricted to those, which is the most critical piece? How is it being handled? That goes back to the whole people in process portion. After the documentation has been collected, then we go on to see exactly what's involved in a system scan, and I'll show you a brief picture of what that looks like on the next slide. We have a particular server. Maybe you've got 5 or 10 servers in your environment. We want to see which of those is included in the scan. So you can see here there's a Windows 2012 R2 server. It runs SQL. It's a database, and it has a backup agent on it, and it's part of the scan selection over on the right-hand side. So, and some of this information's obviously been sanitized, so it's not exposing anybody's information that we might have. After this, we're going to assess the environment and review the results, review the reports, and figure out what the gaps look like. And on the next slide, you'll see we can determine how many problems exist in an environment. I'll give you an example in a second, but we want to determine, are those high as far as severity is concerned? Are those very high risk items? I'll give you an example. Somebody leaves your organization, they're no longer working for you, but the proper cleanup was not done afterwards, meaning the person's account was not disabled, or the password to that account was not changed, their VPN access was not terminated. All of those things are exposures and need to be addressed. And most importantly, we need to find them in the first place. And that's why we're running this vulnerability scan. And after the vulnerability scan, you'll be able to determine what's a high risk item or a high severity item. Here's a couple of examples. Two of the very high priority. This environment is running VMware. Okay, that's the platform that all of the servers run on. Well, in this particular case, there's a vulnerability, a known one, but it has not been patched with the manufacturer's release of an update. You can see it's running vCenter version 6.0.0. There is 6.0.2 out that fixes this particular problem. That's the type of thing that we're trying to uncover and make sure that there are no holes in the environment. There's no exposures. On the next slide, you'll see a very interesting thing that we use a tool that will look at your Active Directory and tell you, hey, we've got accounts that people are trying to use and log into, and we're seeing a lot of failed login attempts. If there's failed login attempts, okay, 1 or 2 means somebody may have forgotten or mistyped their password. You got somebody that's typing the same password or different passwords in 10 times in a row and are failing. Somebody's trying to hack that account. They figured out a valid username on your network, and now they're trying to crack in using different passwords. And they've got programs that will just, if you allow them to, they will just peck and peck and peck away at your environment and try to crack in. It's a very, very easy and known way for people to get into an environment. And the final piece of this is the report. And this report, the actual risk assessment, will not only give us an idea of where there are gaps, but it will, just like on the last example I showed, it will show you what the treatment plan is. What are we going to do? How are we going to remediate the problem? And we've got our ability to do that, but really, at the end of the day, some of these environments are managed by IT companies that we're helping them with. We want to have calls with them to gather the information every week. That's part of the process. As time goes on and we're assessing the environment, we'll have bi-weekly or monthly calls. And you can see there's a complete list of what this report looks like. This is an actual report that was run on an existing operational environment, and you can see those risk scores. Higher numbers are worse. So that's how we determine what's a high severity or high risk item. And you can see there's an entire list there of GDPR regulation. Here's backup, where we've got backups being run, but not on every machine in this particular environment. There's no agents on them. We've got external hard drives plugged in that people can just disconnect and walk away. Those are all items that send up a red flag and need to be addressed as part of the remediation. And that remediation, we don't necessarily believe it's going to take place overnight, but we're here to assist and walk through the process and make sure we're following up and staying on top of it. That's exactly how the process works from the beginning, gathering information, assessing the problems, going through this assessment report, the quote-unquote full report, and really walking through what the they call it a treatment plan. I think remediation is probably the right word that describes exactly what the last phase of the process is. The next slide really wraps this up. And I want to drive home one particular point, because we've had conversations with a lot of folks around HIPAA compliance, because that does resemble some of what we're talking about, how to protect data and make sure you've got a secure environment. You've gathered all this information, you've made an assessment, you've got a remediation plan. I have all the, it says on the side, I have all this data, now what? You have to put together an action plan. And that's what we're here to assist you folks with, anybody that wants to be able to do this. And we're going to look at how do we do items. It's a perfect example. How do you go through a data cleanup? What are the technology projects that need to be performed if we need to be able to get to compliance? That's, at the end of the day, we want to be compliant. We want to help folks do that, but we have to put a plan in place and we have to act on it collectively. I've seen plenty of people back in the day with respect to HIPAA where they just, part of the requirement was having a firewall. They'd go out, they'd buy a firewall, they'd put it on the shelf, they'd never take it out of the box. And back then, if somebody questioned them on it, well, I have one. Doesn't say I have to plug it in, doesn't say I have to do anything with it, but it hacks the new high-tech act that was followed up on, because people saw a lot of holes that they could shoot in the HIPAA guidelines. It's the same thing with GDPR. It's the same thing with ISO 27001. You've got to implement the equipment, implement the service, and make sure to secure the environment. This is the best way I can say it is this is an ongoing process. You can't just look at a plan and say, oh, well, I can fix this and I should be good. This, technology is a constantly evolving animal, and you need to stay out in front of it. And I think that's really the most important point that folks have to understand. Today it's GDPR. Tomorrow, the California Consumer Privacy Act. Could be that. It could be the United States Privacy Act. There will be something else coming that will entice, force, make sure that people protect the data that they're holding. And I think at the end of the day, people have to determine, do they have a good reason to be hanging on to data? Because that's really what forces this whole thing. If you're collecting data for no good reason and you're not using it, you're putting yourself at risk. And I think that's a very important piece of this that a lot of folks don't understand. They put up a form, and that form collects data. Maybe they use it, maybe they don't. But unbeknownst to them, they could be covered under the GDPR guidelines just for collecting information on somebody that resides inside the EU and not even know it. And the fines are ridiculously large. And there's, like I said, 97 folks have already been fined, and not small amounts. 10,000 pounds was the smallest one I found. Typical 50 to 100,000 pounds were the numbers that I was seeing for some of the fines. We'd like to take some questions from the audience. Well, one of these that was sent in was, and somebody caught on to the ISO 27001 information that was popped up there. If I go through GDPR and become compliant with that, does that automatically make me ISO 27001 compliant? And the answer, I hate to say it in one word, no, but it is no, where those are completely separate guidelines, and they have nothing to do with each other as far as compliancy goes. There is, I agree, a lot of overlap, but at the end of the day, They are two completely separate programs. Being 27001 on the front end will get you most of the way there with GDPR. So that will kind of answer that. What is the next or last step in the process? We are offering not only guidelines and guidance to get you compliant, but we're scheduling regular meetings, and this very much resembles our HIPAA Secure program, where we set up weekly meetings on the front end. We're doing a lot of data collection at that point. I want to make sure that people understand that, whether that you're a existing client or a new client to us. And after that, we're running it through our program to understand where the gaps are and if there are any gaps. And then we're having probably 2 phone calls in a month, or back-to-back months. We'll have a phone call and a visit with folks to say, okay, here's what the reports found, here's what they say, here's how we interpret those, and here's the next step. And there will always be something glaring on there to say, hey, look, this is a very important item. You know, I talked to somebody probably 2-3 weeks ago. They've got some of their folks, this is medical related, that are using Hotmail accounts. They're using Yahoo, they're using Google accounts, and they're sending in clear text information on patients and their health records through that email. That is an absolute no-no. And that same type of information does not want to be insecure in any way, whether it be HIPAA or GDPR, NIST as part of the government regulations here in the US. Those are all things that need to be secured, and that is, for that particular client, that's #1 on the list. We've got to get encryption in place to encrypt that information as it's moving, but just as important, they've got to get on corporate-based email. They've got to get it off personal email. There's no way to protect that personal email that the staff member leaves, and you've got no access to wipe their devices because it's a personal account. Those are the types of things that we really want to focus on. We find something like that in each of the reports that we generate, and those are the items that really need to be spoken to directly. I think we're just about out of time.
Yep, Bob,
still have
do you want?
Yeah, go.
We have a couple more questions, but we are running out of time. Do you have anything else that you just want to wrap it up with?
No, I think really the point is that this program is we understand we're gathering data at a point in time, but at the end of the day, our mission is to get that baseline, help you get to the compliance level, make your environment more secure, and follow through as the regulations evolve and change, keeping your environment secure and your data protected, and not just backed up on site is one piece, but making sure it's replicated off site is another component of that. Those are the things that I think are important. Go ahead, Amber.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for attending, everyone. I will be sending the recording either the end of today or tomorrow. Thanks, Bob.